Howdy friends, my name is Milo. I think I saw a Sasquatch. In this upcoming video, I spent some time talking about Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe, which are two incredibly important early megalithic sites located in Turkey. Now, as you may be aware, earlier this month, Turkey was hit by a series of earthquakes. Now, because I am making a video talking about the archaeological sites in Turkey and am actually doing a tour to Turkey to visit these very sites at the end of April, I think that I have some responsibility to try and give something back. Because of this, at the beginning of this month, my team and I started a fundraiser in order to raise funds for some of the smaller areas that have been pretty much left in the dark as far as relief aid. Currently, we are just shy of our $50,000 goal, but I have no doubt that with this video, we are going to be able to make that and possibly even generate more to be able to go to the people who need it most. The link to that will be in the description. I just wanted to put that out here at the beginning of this video because we are all here gathering together to pretty much talk about these ancient sites, and since I'll be actually talking about them in person on location later in April, I figured that we should probably all try and come together and actually work on a project together. I want to thank you again for all of the support. If you're not able to donate, you feel free to just share the video. That will be doing more than enough. Anyway, I know what you're really here for, so let's get right into it. Into the debunking. Also, if you haven't already, you should subscribe so that you can see the videos of Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe when I go there, so that your only frame of reference isn't Graham Hancock standing there talking about it. Lesson 5, put your phones down, class is in session. All right, where are we? Man, this show's really still going. All right, we're more than halfway through. I'd like to give a moment to congratulate all of you on making it this far. This is farther than most people are able to make it. Wow, I just needed this so I could actually feel something. Just a nice little glass of PCBs and microplastics. Welcome back to another episode of Analyzing Ancient Apocalypse. My name is Milo, and we are going to be going through every single one of the episodes of Graham Hancock's Netflix series, Ancient Apocalypse, to review the claim of whether or not there truly was a lost civilization that ruled the world until the end of the last ice age. If you haven't seen the previous episode, you can check it out here, but we're gonna get the ball rolling now with episode 5, so let's get right into it. Episode 5 marks a turning point in Ancient Apocalypse, a point where Graham Hancock goes from overstaying his welcome to really overstaying his welcome. Let's establish the thesis of this episode. The ancients are trying to warn us to pay close attention to the heavens. I cannot string a complete sentence together. To begin this episode, Graham Hancock implies that in the ruins left behind by ancient civilizations, they left us an encoded message, a warning to keep our eyes on the stars lest the same fate befall us that befell them. This is a compelling hypothesis, one that makes us think of things like national treasure and secret clues and mysteries left encoded for future generations to find. But it is also a thesis that can be combated by saying, why would the ancients have given a single shit about us? This hypothesis makes the foundation of episode 5, but it's an important hypothesis to analyze first, because it implies that we are far more significant and important than we actually are. Nothing that you do in your life today is done with the intent of people 12,000 years from now discovering it and being able to learn from it. And I can say without a shadow of a doubt that the same thing applied for people who lived 12,000 years ago. They are as distant to us as we are to them. In fact, we are even more distant to them than they are to us because they didn't even know we would end up existing one day. I cannot fathom what the world will look like 12,000 years from now, or if humans will even exist then. And so just like I am not going to waste my time leaving encoded messages to people 12,000 years in the future, the ancients didn't do it either. So at the risk of sending you all into a massive ego death, I would like us to go into this episode remembering that we are really not all that important. All right, let's get this party started. Gobekli Tepe is one of the most important archaeological sites ever discovered. When it was found in 1994, it completely changed the way that we view ancient people. For those of you who don't know, Gobekli Tepe is a megalithic site located in Turkey. Now, the pyramids of Giza and megalithic sites like that are old, the pyramids dating back to about 4,000 years ago. But Gobekli Tepe blows that out of the water. It dates back a staggering 11,600 years. What makes this site even more incredible is that this site predates agriculture, which which historically has been something which archaeologists use as a hallmark for the point after which megalithic structures can be built. Because once you have agriculture, your society needs to spend less time hunting and gathering, which gives them more downtime, and they have a steady source of food, and they can contribute all of their energy to large-scale megalithic projects like this, which is why we see a correlation between the amount of megalithic and large-scale projects in the ancient world that runs right alongside the rise of agriculture. And yet Gobekli Tepe predates all of that, meaning that it was built by people who were in all likelihood still hunter-gatherers. Now, Graham Hancock has a very interesting way of telling us this. He says that Gobekli Tepe shouldn't exist, which is dumb because there it is, and it does exist. Now, it may seem like I'm nitpicking language here. Obviously, he's not trying to debunk the fact that it exists, but it sets the tone that he's going to present the rest of the episode with, which is this idea that Gobekli Tepe is some sort of oddity, something that needs a deep and, massive explanation behind it. And so, again, as I've said at the beginning of every other episode so far, he has already set the stage for you to doubt the legitimacy of this site, greasing the skids to be able to give you his hypothesis at the end and prepping you to be able to accept it. He says that the locals at the time would have been hunter-gatherers living in mud huts, which further adds the idea that you need to doubt that Gobekli Tepe was built by hunter-gatherers. He really wants you to think that archaeologists are portraying the people that built Gobekli Tepe as being primitive savages who were incapable of doing anything other than spear the mammoth. But nobody actually thinks like that. I mean, hunter-gatherer or not, they built this. I would sooner judge them on their construction skills over whether or not they were growing their crops or harvesting them from a field naturally. That doesn't really dictate how sophisticated they were as a people. But Graham Hancock needs to make it seem like these two things are incompatible. He needs to make it seem like hunter-gatherers wouldn't be capable of doing this, because once you accept the reality that they were, then his hypothesis doesn't really need to exist anymore. He tries to throw a little bit more mysticism into the beginning, doing the classic tactic of saying we don't know how they lifted these blocks into place, which always cracks me up. You hear that in just about every conspiracy, whether it be Stonehenge, the pyramids at Giza, Machu Picchu, any of that stuff. They're like, how did they lift them? Which is just foolish, because when you look at a stone that has been lifted into place, it doesn't really matter how it was lifted because it clearly was. It's just this way of trying to muddy the water and make it seem like there's more mystery around it than there is. Whether they lifted it by piling stones under it, lifting it with ropes, or just getting a bunch of dudes to put their back into it doesn't change the fact that it was built by these people. Now, one of the most amazing things about Gobekli Tepe is the art. Not only is it a spectacular megalithic site, but the pillars are carved with hundreds of these beautiful pictographs. One of the most infamous of these is the Vulture Stone, and one which Graham Hancock talks about ad nauseum throughout the course of this episode. Which, firstly, before we taint it by talking about what Graham Hancock has to say, let's all take a moment to look at that. Man, that's fucking cool. Now, Graham Hancock says that all of these carvings are highly stylized, which to him suggests that they are more symbolic than literal. Now, you might be wondering why I'm pointing this out, because that is a perfectly fair deduction. But once again, Graham Hancock is preparing you so that he can spoon-feed you his idea later, and you will be a lot more willing to accept the idea he's spoon-feeding to you if you have already sort of subconsciously accepted that they are symbolic. Now, Graham Hancock is not one to be able to deduce whether or not these carvings are symbolic or not. As far as my research has taken me, the jury is still out on it. We don't know what these carvings represent. They could very well literally be a carving of a vulture that was just a vulture. They could be a spirit or a god, or who knows, maybe it's a map or something like that. The point is, we don't know. Understanding the intention behind art is something which is really difficult to do. For example, take cave art. Now, we may look at this today as being a beautiful artistic interpretation or representation of animals, but we don't really know the reasons why they were done. One of the theories for what cave art represents is that it was almost an instruction manual on what animals to hunt. One of the themes that you will see running through a lot of cave art, especially throughout Europe, is that it doesn't depict a lot of carnivorous animals. It's mostly bison and horses and things like that. And because of the absence of more dangerous predatory animals, they theorized that there was some logical reason why there was more easy to hunt animals depicted on these walls. So that doesn't really have a lot to do with Gobekli Tepe, but it stands to suggest that the interpretation of art, ancient art in our modern world, is something which is iffy at best. In episode 5, Graham Hancock begins to repeat the same thing he said in the episode where he went to Malta. how did they succeed at their first attempt of building something like this? On Malta, you know, he goes to Gigantia and he's like, well, there's no smaller temples. You'd expect to see smaller temples. So someone must have showed up and taught them how to do this. Just because Gobekli Tepe was, at the time that it was found, the oldest megalithic site on Earth, nobody ever would tell you that this is the oldest megalithic site, period. There are so many sites that we haven't found yet. You cannot put a label on a thing like that. This is also especially funny because he goes on later to mention Karahan Tepe, which is an even older megalithic site nearby to Gobekli Tepe, which is, you know, older. Now, do I think that Graham Hancock thinks that people are actually saying this was their first attempt to build something? Absolutely not. But what he is doing here is making it sound like this is what other people think, because then it makes them sound so ridiculous that anything he says to you is going to be something you believe. He has a great quote which sort of ties on to this, which is, he says it a lot throughout this episode. He says, "You don't just wake up one morning and decide to build this," which is just boiling it down to such a infantile level that it's just comedic. Nobody on God's green earth would ever tell you that someone just woke up and decided, you know what would look good on that hill? Gobekli Tepe. And he repeats this mantra over and over again throughout the course of this episode because he really wants to sow the seeds of doubt in your mind. He wants to make Gobekli Tepe seem so impossible so that you're willing to accept whatever he tells you. And he also sort of implies the two options here are A, you either wake up one morning and decide to build Gobekli Tepe, or B, Atlanteans come out of the ocean and teach you how to build Gobekli Tepe. But the beautiful irony is that his theory only works if you accept the fact that this really was just the first megalithic site, that there is just no archaeological record before this and this thing suddenly just sprouts out of the ground. He acts like it's common sense that ancient people had the ability to do this stuff and then acts shocked when they actually did it. It's like, I don't know, I'm imagining Graham Hancock with the surprised Pikachu face. But now we get into the brunt of it, where Graham Hancock says that this is, quote, "not the miraculous overnight invention of hunter-gatherers, but a legacy from a lost advanced civilization that mainstream archaeology finds offensive." The thing that I find the most offensive about this show is just how much whining Graham Hancock does. Seriously, I know that Dr. McCafferty said that Graham Hancock is great to work with, and I'm sure he would be lovely to actually be able to sit down and talk to, but man, the way that he paints himself throughout this episode is just insufferable. But we have to remember that in Graham Hancock's story, archaeologists are the bad guys, and so he has to vilify them at any chance he gets. So by saying that mainstream archaeology finds this idea offensive, he is othering someone, and that way anyone who's watching the show who has a little thought in their head of like, wow, maybe he actually is kind of full of shit, they're going to subconsciously not want to be othered, and it will make them a little bit, maybe reluctantly, agree with his theories later on. It's just a very manipulative tactic, and he does it for literally the entire series, and I'll get to that later, but it's just amazing to witness. It really goes to show how far you can get if you're just really good at talking. Hypothetically. So after talking about Gobekli Tepe, which I appear to already have erased, he goes to the next site. Karahan Tepe is awesome. This site predates Gobekli Tepe. It was only very recently discovered. It's still being excavated, and they are finding all kinds of crazy stuff there. And you want to know the best thing is this series is the very first time that they allowed outside camera crews into it. The debut of one of the oldest megalithic sites on planet Earth was on Ancient Apocalypse. Dog. I'm gonna eat that dog one of these days. It is just such a shame that the debut of this pivotal archaeological site had to be on a conspiracy television series. Imagine what it would be like if a real archaeologist was able to go there. Someone who could appreciate the site and be able to teach the masses about it. Someone who was able to, you know, go there and film and be able to teach people about it. And I don't know, maybe even bring some people with him. Oh, that would be just crazy, wouldn't it? Anyway, Graham Hancock stands in a room with a bunch of penises. Do you really think I wasn't going to draw this one? Of course I'm going to draw this one. There's a room at Karahan Tepe that is full of 10 enormous stone phalluses, and Graham Hancock stands in it for a while, and frankly, it's my favorite part of the entire series. He also notes that there's a giant stone head that's overlooking all of it, and it makes him feel like it's very sinister. He's sad now. I would like to propose this to be the new thumbnail art for episode 5 of Ancient Apocalypse on Netflix. If you would like to use this, Netflix, feel free to contact me as long as you pay me, I don't know, half of whatever you gave Graham Hancock to make his penis show. So anyway, Graham Hancock walks around the penis room for a while and talks about how this site is probably way older with no evidence. He talks about how this site is probably way older with no evidence, and then, you know, goes back into his new age mystic bullshit. Now, one thing he does say when he's standing in the penis room that I just erased is that when he's standing there, he feels an overwhelming sense of dread. And honestly, that is the one thing in this episode, or in his, I guess, mystical way of thinking, that I completely understand. I have been traveling and exploring places since as long as I could walk, and one of my favorites is ghost towns. I've done multiple trips where I've gone and, you know, looked at old logging camps and mining camps and whatnot, and there are some places out in the world where you just walk into it and the energy is bad. I vividly remember one I was out with my friend, and we walked through this ghost town. I think it was in like Arizona, and we were going through all the buildings and whatnot, and there was this one room in one building where we walked into it, and both of us just looked at each other and were like, this is bad, we need to go. Something about this one gives me a weird vibe, and I don't know what it is. Where are you? Upstairs. Yeah, I'm not feeling here. Something's off. I'm getting out. I'm gonna go with my gut and say I don't want to be in that building. And there was completely unspoken, but there is something in the back of your head. And so I do completely understand what he's saying there. Is that science? Absolutely not. But, you know, I can understand what that emotion is like. So Graham Hancock's theory about why Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe exist is that there was the lost civilization who showed up and taught and mobilized the hunter-gatherers of the area to make these sites, which is weird because it's admitting that hunter-gatherers had the capability to do it, and the only thing that someone needed to do was teach them, which sounds a lot like you're saying they were really stupid. So see, what they did is they actually did build these sites, but it wasn't because it was their own idea. It was because the Atlanteans came out of the sea and told them, hey, what if you stacked up some rocks? And they were like, well, that's a great idea. And so he claims that these Atlanteans or whatever came from the sea and taught the people at Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe how to build these sites, and then taught them agriculture as well, which is weird. It doesn't really take into account the fact that plants take thousands of years to become domesticated, and it's not a process that was done consciously. And we have, you know, records of all these plants slowly being domesticated over time in different parts of the world, and there is no common crop through all different parts of the world that you think there would be if there was a lost civilization that knew how to farm and introduced it to people. It's so annoying because Graham Hancock's theory actually makes Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe even less impressive, because the whole reason they are so archaeologically significant is because they were built before the advent of agriculture. They are so impressive because they have made archaeologists reassess the way that they think about megalithic sites. They have made archaeologists question and change the things that we think our ancestors were capable of, because archaeologists change their beliefs when presented with new facts, despite what Graham Hancock may tell you. So what is Graham Hancock's evidence that these sites were, you know, built by a civilizing force from the sea, and that the people who came out of the sea also taught the locals how to farm? If you guessed Mesopotamian folklore from 5,000 years ago, you'd be absolutely correct. Again, I'm all for using folklore, but if your only evidence for an entire lost civilization is story from a religion 5,000 years ago, I'm sorry, brother, but I'm not buying it. It's also a completely different time in history. The Gobekli Tepe would have been built 6,000 years beforehand. Why would this story have cropped up 5,000 years ago? I couldn't tell you. But what he does say is that the creation stories and these folklore stories contain a list of things that are all supposedly invented at Gobekli Tepe, essentially proving that Gobekli Tepe is the site that was built by these lost civilizations. So what is that list of things that were supposedly invented at Gobekli Tepe? There it is. There is no list. He never gives us a list, and I cannot find a list of things that were supposedly invented at Gobekli Tepe. Again, I'm pretty sure that Graham Hancock actually is the only person on Earth who truly does believe that Gobekli Tepe was the first megalithic structure ever built, and it happened overnight. He then does his classic rhetorical idea of talking about multiple types of folklore from different parts of the world and how they all have similar themes. He mentions the folklore of the Mayans, the Olmecs, the Toltecs, and the Assyrians, which I guess wouldn't be in the same part of the world, but case in point when he just used Mesopotamian folklore as the benchmark. Then he says, he claims that Gobekli Tepe and Gigantia are both evidence that those groups of people had access to a shared pool of knowledge. All of those people had access to the same pool of knowledge because they all lived around one another. Gobekli Tepe and Gigantia are really not all that far apart from one another and separated by thousands of years. So I promise you the idea of lifting rocks up is not something that would have been new to any of these people. It's just ridiculous to claim that all these people in different parts of the world needed someone to teach them how to use probably the only resource that every part of the world has, stone. Like, hey, coming off the boat, yo, what are you gonna teach us about? Oh my god, you're telling me I can put that on top of another one of that. Next thing you know, you're gonna tell me that you can grow grass. What? We're back to the Vulture Stone now. I hope you brought your rubber bands, because this one's a stretch. Graham Hancock talks with a man named Martin Sweatman, who claims that the Vulture Stone is a star map, and he says that it represents asterisms or star clusters. Now, what star cluster does that look like to you? And now he notes that on the Vulture Stone, there is a scorpion motif. And so, obviously, he says that this is the constellation Scorpio. I don't know about you, but every time I go out with someone who knows things about constellations, and they go up and they're like, hey, look at that, it's Orion's belt. I look at them and I go, are you on crack? There is no constellation that actually looks like the things people says it looks like. So if you're telling me that someone looked at the sky 12,000 years ago and was like, man, that looks like a scorpion, then you are absolutely full of it. This, again, is Graham Hancock and this Martin guy falling into the same trap of thinking that we are way more important than we actually are. Why would people 12,000 years ago have used the same astrological signs we do? One of the oldest like zodiacs that we have is the zodiac of Dendera, which I talked about in my Dendera Light video, and this carving predates that by 10,000 years. You cannot tell me that those people were looking at the sky and seeing the same things that we do. But because Graham Hancock told you at the beginning of this episode that these are more symbolic carvings, he has already greased the skids for you to be like, man, those do line up pretty good. That must be Scorpio. So now that we know that the scorpion is actually the Scorpio constellation, well, then you can just plop that on a star map and boom, what do you know? The vulture is Sagittarius and something else is connected to something else as well. And he says that the center circle is the sun and that it's all like a giant calendar pointing us to a certain date to warn those in the future to watch out for the thing that destroyed them. I know I've said this a million times in this series so far, but it really does feel like these people just watched National Treasure as a kid and no one told them that that's not actually how the real world works. So Graham Hancock says that all of this is evidence that Gobekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe and all these pillars are pointing towards this being a reboot of civilization. Civilization wiped clean by the wrath of God during the Younger Dryas and then rebooted by the Atlanteans who taught people how to put rocks together. He says that it's not just a cultural site, but it's a memory, it's a warning, which is super flashy and cool sounding, but also doesn't really make any sense, and he hasn't given us any evidence for it other than just saying it. Then he says one of my favorite things in this entire episode. He claims that Gobekli Tepe was intentionally and rapidly buried, as if it was a time capsule that was meant to be sealed away to warn future generations of the great cataclysm that wiped everyone out at the end of the Younger Dryas. The reason this is my favorite thing is because it's just straight up not true. There is absolutely no evidence that Gobekli Tepe was intentionally buried. I don't really know why he says this. Well, I do know why he says this. He says this because it makes it sound more dramatic, but it's wrong, so I guess it's probably important to, you know, tell you the truth. But again, I mean, I guess it's okay to tell some lies when the only evidence you have is just sort of making things up and saying that things look like other things. Disembodied voice Milo here for a quick addendum. According to a paper published by Dietrich et al., there is evidence that some of the rooms at Gobekli Tepe had some infill put back into them at different points throughout the site's existence. It is theorized that part of the reason for this is because the site was experiencing serious erosion, which would explain the retaining walls and structural infill used at the site. And the presence of those structures actually goes on to further support why the entire site is buried. Not because it was buried all at once to keep it saved as a time capsule, but because the site was subjected to extreme erosion. Erosion which was so drastic that the builders of Gobekli Tepe had to take it into account while the site was still active. So while there is evidence of structural earthworks at the site, there is no evidence at all to suggest the idea that the entire site was ritualistically buried. You'll notice that I haven't even talked that much about archaeology this episode because there's so little archaeology in this now that I can't even apply my knowledge base because the things he's saying are just so out there. It really is essentially an unfalsifiable hypothesis. Like, can I prove to you without a shadow of a doubt that Atlanteans didn't come out of the sea and teach people how to build Gobekli Tepe? I mean, I guess not really, but does it seem like a very logical conclusion? Serpents. Man, that's good. Graham Hancock notes that there's serpent carvings at multiple sites, which is really cool, I guess. Now, I'm not gonna act like an idiot. Graham Hancock is saying this because he's queuing up the next episode. What's going on, little Lou? You okay, buddy? And that's the end of episode 5. No material evidence, no genetic evidence, no actual evidence. Hell, there's just no evidence. We've gotten a report that there hasn't been a sponsor yet in this video. It's nice to meet you. I'm Officer Thought Police Milo, and I'm here to tell you about today's sponsor. Because today's sponsor is Ground News. Are you sick and tired of the media lying to you? Yeah? Well, I am too. News media is full of predatory algorithms that make sure you are fed news that only fits into your biases, keeping you soft, weak, and coddled. And I won't allow that, which is why I'm proud to endorse Ground News. Ground News is the world's first media comparison platform, showing not only the news, but the news as it's being reported on by multiple different sources across the political spectrum. Ground News allows you to help spot biases in the news that you may be exposed to, as well as better inform your opinions by looking at multiple sources from multiple sides of the spectrum. One of the things that I love the most about Ground News, beyond the fact that it's just the news feed that I use, is looking at a really divisive political topic in America and then looking at how it's being reported on by like the extremes of both sides of the political spectrum. It never ceases to make me piss myself laughing looking at how different the titles are. It is certainly eye-opening to see how easily they are able to manipulate their headlines to say pretty much whatever they want. Now, Ground News is not only for the United States. They also do international news, which is something I'm a big fan of because it's cool to hear about what's going on in a part of the world that isn't, well, this one. And that allows me to not only be more informed about the goings on here, but the goings on, well, here. You guys know that facts are important to me, and so I mean when I say that I can't recommend Ground News enough because they offer the one thing that everyone in search of facts should be looking for, and that is a view into every single side. You will never find a truth if the facts are the same every time. If you'd like to check out Ground News, you can use this link, which is also in the description. You can use Ground News for free, but there's also a subscription service if you want all the extra frills on the edge. And also clicking that link just helps me out. Once again, I'd like to give a massive thank you to Ground News for sponsoring this video. And now I believe that this disturbance has been dealt with, so I'm gonna let you guys get back to whatever it is you're doing here. Lesson 6, class is in session. Ancient Apocalypse, Episode 6, America's Lost Civilization. Graham Hancock begins this episode with a bold claim. If you went to school between 1960 and 2010, you were taught an outdated history of the peopling of North America. This is the most hilarious way that Graham Hancock could start this episode, because his entire series is predicated on the idea that archaeologists are opposed to accepting any new information that would challenge the status quo. It is very interesting to see that right off the bat he admits that the story of the peopling of North America changed when, presented with new evidence. Some of this evidence is, of course, the White Sands prints, which are a set of footprints found in New Mexico. I have talked about these before, and they are dated to about 23,000 years ago. You're never gonna guess who they were found by. Archaeologists. And this is why archaeologists question everything, because we want to be able to further our understanding. We are looking for facts. And if we didn't question anything, then you could just say whatever you want and no one would question it, Graham Hancock. He also brings up the Sssserpentssss Macedon site, which is a site that I've talked about. You should check out that video if you haven't already. But it's a site that suggests that there could have been some sort of hominid presence in North America about 130,000 years ago. For quick spark notes, one of the hypotheses around the Sssserpentssss Macedon site is that it is a Macedon kill site with some evidence of primitive stone tool usage that predates all other habitation in North America by nearly 100,000 years. And in my video about that, I fully admitted that I would not be opposed to finding evidence like this. In fact, I am, I almost want to believe in it. I think it would be really interesting to have the history of human settlement of North America changed so much in our lifetime. However, I am a scientist, and so I'm going to need a little bit more evidence than that one site before I fully sign on and 100% believe it. What I will say is that episode 6 has the strongest start out of any episode of Ancient Apocalypse, and one that I do genuinely want to give Graham Hancock credit for, because he starts with a wonderful speech talking about the injustice of just how many indigenous sites were destroyed during the colonization of North America. He mentions the staggering statistic that 90% of indigenous earthenworks and mounds and grave sites were destroyed as westward expansion happened and fields were plowed. And now, fair warning, I am going to be critical of the way which Graham Hancock portrays the paleo-indigenous population of North America, but I do want to give him credit off the bat that his heart is in the right place. It really does seem like he is trying to be aware of these problems and, trying to raise awareness about them. And so I really do mean when I say I genuinely appreciate it. However, this initial speech is undermined slightly with the actual content of this episode. All right, everyone put on your expedition hats because we're going on a field trip. Poverty Point is a paleo-indigenous mound site in the modern state of Louisiana. It has an enormous central mound, some concentric half-circular mounds, and the remains of wooden ring complexes. Now, south of Poverty Point is another mound complex called the Lower Jackson Mound. And Lower Jackson Mound is old, dating to about 3000 BCE, or about 5,000 years ago. Graham Hancock claims that this is all part of some elaborate plan, and that Poverty Point Mound and the Lower Jackson Mound are connected to one another, and it was all part of some huge earthen work that, I don't know, did something. It is worth noting that the builders of the Poverty Point Mound, as well as the Jackson Mound, would have all, lived in the same area and probably been exposed to the same resources and cultural influences and whatnot, and does not necessarily mean that all these sites are connected. But the big bow that Graham Hancock sort of puts on all of these sites is that they are astrological mounds. They are mounds that were meant to observe the heavens and, be almost a giant clock for the, the winter and summer solstices, which there is quite a lot of evidence to suggest. There is evidence to suggest that there are many sites all around the world that all have, solstice-oriented alignments. Now let's brainstorm for a minute, shall we, of why would it be that so many places around the world have these solstice alignments? Is it because Atlanteans came out of the sea and taught them how to make calendars, or were warning them to look to the heavens to guard them against the ancient evil that will wipe them out? Or is it because every single group of people around the world could look at the sky? Graham goes on to say that archaeologists are reluctant to accept astronomy into their field, and that we view it as, an infringement into our territory, which is just foolish. One of the most amazing things about working in the field of archaeology is that it is an interdisciplinary field. We rely on the work of other people in order to be able to draw our conclusions. You need to work alongside geologists, you need to work alongside botanists, you need to work alongside zoologists. There is so many fields that tie into archaeology, and without them, we would be nothing. Archaeology is, to put it broadly, the study of quite literally everything. When you go back to look at a site like this, you aren't just going back to look at one specific feature. I'm not a paleobotanist. I don't go back in time to just look at the plants. You're going back to try and assess an entire time in history, and because of that, you are dealing with all the facets of life that we deal with today. And so it only makes sense, and it only works if you are able to listen to other people. And the fact that Graham Hancock has all of this information at his disposal is proof enough that archaeologists collaborate with plenty of people outside of their field. Now, Graham Hancock does go on to clarify that he does not claim that Poverty Point was built by this lost advanced civilization, which I'm glad, because that would be a rather foolish thing to say. But what he does say is that he is looking for evidence that this knowledge was inherited. Now, he never really specifies exactly what knowledge he's talking about, but I think it is safe to say that he's either talking about massive earthenwork constructions or, solstice alignments in astronomy, because those are kind of the two most, out there and advanced things that he talks about throughout the course of this episode. But once again, as I have said in every single episode of this so far, you do not need someone to come out of the ocean to teach you how to pile dirt up and look at the sky. And you can see how that is a really dangerous way of thinking, to imply that this group of people who built these mounds needed someone to come teach them how to do it. And so Graham Hancock pretty quickly actually walks his own words back, because he realizes that he's probably going to have quite a lot of people pointing at him if he just decides to roll with this train of thought. And he goes on to say, of course they could do this by themselves, because, the thing he's implying is that paleo-indigenous Americans were incapable of piling dirt up. And I appreciate his sentiment. I'm glad that he specifies, I'm not saying they weren't capable of doing this and whatnot, but his point is a little bit moot when everything else that he says and all the evidence he presents throughout the rest of the episode is predicated on the idea that they were taught how to do this. So whether or not you're explicitly saying it, you still are kind of saying that they couldn't do it without an outsider's help. He then does his classic, his special attack, where he lists all sorts of different sites around the world that have something in common. In this case, the thing that all the sites he lists have in common is that they have a solstice orientation. I will say once again, what is the one thing all these places had in common? Is that they were visited by Atlanteans, or they could see the sun. And then he brings up a bunch of other North American mound sites, which also supposedly have solstice orientations. The mound sites that he talks about are, alongside Poverty Point, the Cahokia site, the Moundville site. Actually talked about that in my Grave Creek Stone video. Actually, once again, that name is so terribly bad. Saudi Nakuchi, the Etowah Mounds, and the Iowa Effigy Mounds. All right, now we're gonna do an interactive activity where you're gonna interact with yourself and I'm gonna pretend like I can see you. What do all these things have in common? I'll give you 10 seconds. I'm kidding, I'm not giving you 10 seconds. If you guessed all of them are in North America and every single one of them could see the sun, you'd be absolutely right. It amazes me how readily Graham Hancock omits the idea of cultural dissemination, the idea that multiple people in the same geographic region would collaborate with one another. They would share ideas with one another. The thoughts and the plans that people had would diffuse throughout different cultural groups, and as a result, you see a lot of similar themes throughout different groups in the same area. And so it's no small wonder that mounds were so important to these people, and it's also no small wonder that a solstice orientation of these mounds was also important. Now, the big grand slam that Graham Hancock goes to in this video is Serpent Mound in Ohio. You have probably seen Serpent Mound if you have ever looked at a book about the history of North America or have ever played Red Dead Redemption 2. It is a spectacularly well-preserved effigy mound located in Ohio in the United States, and Graham Hancock absolutely loves it, and I absolutely loved writing about this part because he says some crazy stuff. So Graham Hancock's first qualm with this site is that the sign says that it is from 1000 AD, and Graham Hancock does not like that very much. So there's one thing I actually can agree with Graham Hancock on, and that is that the sign at Serpent Mound is incorrect. The Serpent Mound does not date to 1000 BCE. The oldest date that the Serpent Mound has been found to date to is around 320 BCE, making the Serpent Mound a little over 2,000 years old, which is still crazy old. By this point, North America was in the early woodland period, which is the Paleo-Indigenous period, which refers to the people who lived about 500 BCE to about 1000 AD. And it is theorized that this is when the first construction at Serpent Mound happened. Now you note I said first construction because Serpent Mound was reconstructed twice throughout its history. And the second date that archaeologists found is that it dates to about 1000 CE, and I believe is attributed to the Fort Ancient people. You little fucker, come here. This guy ate a plant. Tell him that he did a bad thing. Look at him, his tiny little face, and tell him, no, you can't have that. You're not old enough. You're too small. So the site was reconstructed in about 1000 CE by the Fort Ancient people. Now let's put a nice little bow on the archaeological evidence here. I love this. It's really cool. It tells us that the site was reconstructed. It implies that it was an important site for more than one group of people. Can you imagine being in the Fort Ancient civilization and stumbling across this thing that was built 1300 years before you were there and reconstructing it? It's amazing. Now the problem with this is that it opened the gates for Graham Hancock to just be able to say, well, if it was reconstructed once, it must have been reconstructed for as long as it's convenient for me to fit it into my hypothesis. Graham Hancock really likes this theory. It's his Russian nesting doll hypothesis. That paper bag never knew what hit it. Nice work, Louis. Now, Graham Hancock has come up with what I like to call the Russian nesting doll theory. This theory, actually wait, no. This is the Russian nesting doll law. The Russian nesting doll law, as pioneered by Rossi et al., dictates that every single thing on Earth is built on top of a conveniently dated older version of itself. It's fact. I published many papers on it. Don't try and Google them though, because mainstream academia is trying to silence me, and they deleted them all, and they blocked me on Pinterest. Okay, that was pretty funny, but now we're about to get to the really funny part, because this story gets so much better. Because the people at Serpent Mound decided to ban Hancock. I'm convinced that the reason Graham Hancock talks about Serpent Mound so much in this episode is purely because they banned him from the site, and so he just saw it as a perfect opportunity to just continue his ceaseless browbeating of mainstream academia. So the way that he tells us he was banned is hilarious. He's like, it is hard to get an accurate date of this site because they banned me from going there, or something like that, which is just hilarious because it implies that Graham Hancock was gonna show up there and do his own archaeological dig. All right, guys, I'm gonna figure this out. I'm the rogue researcher, and I'm gonna drill a core, and I'm gonna get a radiocarbon date myself. There's no way that the people at Serpent Mound would have let you into the place with just like a bunch of testing equipment, like you're some like, you know, like rogue John Wick researcher who's like, I'm here to get a radiocarbon date. So what does Graham Hancock do after being banned from Serpent Mound? Well, I'll tell you. He goes to the gate outside of Serpent Mound, and he stands there and he complains about how they're censoring him. Disembodied voice Milo back again with another editor's note. Graham Hancock actually actually wasn't banned from this site. A YouTube channel by the name of Digging Up Ancient Aliens actually got in touch with Serpent Mound to check this claim, and found that in reality what had happened is Hancock had requested 4 days of commercial filming at the site. Now, because 4 days of commercial filming at a site with a massive crew is a huge undertaking, Serpent Mound declined his request, which is an important piece of context to have because Hancock talks about this site as if there were armed guards at the gate trying to keep him out. Obviously, hyperbole there, but he didn't get banned from the site, and so it's really funny that he goes on to talk about how he's being censored by mainstream academia when they just told him that he can't film there for 4 days with his entire film crew at a, active, important historical site and, major tourist destination. Anyway, that's just an important piece of context. Link to the video that talks about that will be in the description. Let's get back to it. Which I don't know about you, but I am just so sick of people whining about censorship. I don't know. Louis, get your little... If you keep being a bitch, I'm gonna have to put you in solitary again. You wanna do that? You wanna get locked up? Would you be willing to throw away your life? You wouldn't download a house. What you looking at? I'm just so tired of hearing people who are not being censored complain about being censored. Just because somebody drew a boundary does not mean that your rights are being infringed. It's just so childish. He says that he was denied access to the site on ideological and personal grounds, which definitely makes it sound pretty intense. And now honestly, this is an ethics question. So you are at your full right to completely disagree with this and say that it is, some form of censorship or some form of restricting freedom of press to, not allow Graham Hancock access to the site. And when I was first watching the episode, honestly, when he read the email from Serpent Mound, I was sort of like, damn, that's a little harsh. Too bad he wasn't able to go there, even though I didn't really support what he was doing in the first place. But, everyone should be given an equal opportunity. But as I thought about this a little bit more, I realized that it is infinitely more complicated than whether or not Graham Hancock can stand in front of a giant mound of dirt. Now, if you do think that this is an unethical thing to do, I don't blame you. But let me tell you this, just to sort of inform that opinion a little bit further. Now, obviously, the Serpent Mound is an archaeological site, but more importantly than that, it is a cultural site, because the descendants of the people who built this mound still live here, and that site is still important to them. It's not quite like Gobekli Tepe or the Malta temples, where there's these sites that are so ancient that there's sort of really no living connection to them. But places like the Serpent Mound are some of the last remaining physical reminders of a faith system that once covered an entire continent. So think about how disrespectful it would be if I were to go to Temple Mount or to Calvary or something like that, a place with a huge amount of religious and spiritual significance to a major world religion, and then I were to, bring my camera crew in there and start drilling into the ground to get radiocarbon dates and telling everyone that it was built by Atlanteans. That would be just cripplingly disrespectful. And so just because this site isn't an important site for a Western religion or a religion that you hear about all the time doesn't mean that it still isn't a sacred site. And so to tie a little bow on it, yeah, it is totally within their right to tell Graham Hancock that he's not allowed to come there and preach about how this sacred religious site is a, fabrication by, I don't know, Atlanteans or something. And beyond that, I think that gives Graham Hancock even less of a right to whine about it as much as he does. If this site was sacred to me, I would also probably tell you to just fuck off. Anyway, lightening the mood, I think it's absolutely hilarious that Graham Hancock films this entire section just standing outside of the gates of Serpent Mound, though he does say that the people at Serpent Mound are crushing opposing views by denying access, which Graham Hancock, the only thing that permission would have given you is just allowing you to be wrong on the other side of a fence. They also have someone fly a drone over Serpent Mound, which I don't know if that's legal. I'm assuming it is, or they wouldn't have done it, but I just think it's really funny. They're like, oh, you won't let me in? Well, what if I fly over it? Anyway, okay, that's enough of that. Now let's get into his evidence for this site being older. The oldest the Serpent Mound has ever been dated to is about 2,000 years ago. So how old does Graham Hancock think it is? 3,000? 4,000? 5,000 years? Graham Hancock thinks that the Serpent Mound is 10,000 years old. Shocking 8,000 years older than the actual recorded date. Now, what is his evidence for pushing the date back by, 5 times older than it actually is? His evidence is, Serpent Mound is a solstice-oriented site where the summer solstice sun will set in the serpent's mouth, and at the back of one of the curves in its tail, the winter solstice sun rises. It's an amazing site, and it has some wonderful astronomical alignments. But his theory is that because the mouth is 2 degrees off from where the sun rises on the summer solstice, it must have been built 10,000 years ago because that's when it would have lined up perfectly. I don't know, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but to expect that people building a mound out of dirt would be able to do it with such mathematical precision using degrees and things that we use today seems like a bit of a stretch. And again, this is another really frustrating thing because, like, look at the solstice alignments. It's really cool. Graham Hancock's reasoning for why it must be that, 2-degree off thing is, why would you go through all this effort and not get it exactly right? I can't argue with that, Graham. Well, yeah, why didn't they get it right? Yeah, those idiots. But this dating method is something which we have seen him use before. He used the star Sirius to date the Gigantea temples to conveniently line up with his hypothesis. He is now doing the same thing at the mound complexes in North America, and I never thought I'd have to say this, but hypothesizing that something is lined up with a star and then just trying to find when the star lined up better than it does now is not a way that you date something in archaeology. That just doesn't work. You're gonna need to do something a little more concrete. I don't know, maybe like radiocarbon dating. But anyway, Graham Hancock's master plan is that this site goes back about 10,000 years, and he even pushes a little more to about 12,800 in his big, Younger Dryas theory thing. And one of his other theses for this is that this is the farthest south that the Laurentide ice sheet traveled. And so he suggests that while the ice sheet was at its maximum extent, ancient people built Serpent Mound at the foot of the Laurentide ice sheet. Glacial history is one of my favorite things. I'm a big nerd about that. So the second Graham Hancock decided to open this can of worms, I was like, bring it on, dog. I got a fistful of rings and a head full of geology. So firstly, let's talk about what the world was like during the last glacial maximum. There is absolutely no way in hell that anyone would stick around long enough to build a mound at the foot of the ice sheet, because winters at the foot of the Laurentide would get down to -30 degrees Fahrenheit. There would be no trees, there would be no plants, it would be a desolate, rocky wasteland with literally nothing in it. There would be no reason for you to be there, and especially to spend the time building a giant snake mound. And technically he is not wrong about that. The Serpent Mound is directly at the foot of the Laurentide ice sheet. The only thing he doesn't mention is that it is at the terminus of the Illinoisan extent of the Laurentide ice sheet. Milo, what's the Illinoisan glacial limit? The Illinoisan glacial limit is the last maximum that the ice sheet reached, which was, 120 to 300,000 years ago. So, no people building stuff then, sorry. Now, I will admit it is still pretty close to the Wisconsin glacial limit, which is the most recent ice age. And that hit its glacial limit about 25,000 years ago. The terminus of the Wisconsin glaciation would have been about 25 miles north of where Serpent Mound is now. And now, are you ready for my big theory? Because in a way, I do think that Graham Hancock is actually right that the Laurentide ice sheet did influence why Serpent Mound is built where it is. Bring up the topographic map of Ohio. You will notice that everything north of this site is completely flat. That would be because the Laurentide ice sheet grounded down to nothingness twice. Well, everything is flat except for the Bellefontaine outlier, but that's a totally separate thing. Very cool though. Maybe I'll talk about that at some point. So the land that you're left over with is pretty much this series of rolling hills that suddenly ends, and it's just flat until you get to the ice sheet in Canada. So to me, it is no small wonder that the paleo-indigenous people decided to build on this hill. Is it because they knew it was the terminus of the ice sheet? Absolutely not. It's because it just happened to be where the hills ended. So do I think that it's a coincidence that these two things line up? Not really. Do I think it's because they were living at the foot of the ice sheet? Absolutely not. Anyway, that was my little, I really went down a glacial rabbit hole on that one, but I figured I should share. He then goes on to mention more folklore. He talks about Iroquois myth, where there was a serpent in the sky that was like struck down with lightning, and he uses that to talk about the fact that there was a meteor or something, and then he claims that the Serpent Mound, or the Serpent Mound, was a depiction of a meteor streaking across the sky. Now, the idea that the Serpent Mound is a depiction of a meteor is nothing new. In fact, one of the major running theories right now is that Serpent Mound may in some way represent Halley's Comet, which just so happened to become visible in 1066 AD, which also happens, oh, I got rid of it, but it just so happens to be around the same date that Serpent Mound was reconstructed by the Fort Ancient people. And so it's not impossible this is a meteorite. Is it the one that triggered the Younger Dryas? Probably not. And that's the end of episode 6. We're gonna resume with Lesson 7 after a brief break.